CBC News has learned government officials in the United States may be considering trade sanctions with Canada over Quebec's language law. Bill 96 was passed by the province 2 years ago. It's aimed at strengthening protections for the French language. CBC's Elizabeth Thompson joins us live now from Ottawa. So, Elizabeth, you've been going over these documents exclusively obtained by CBC News. What have you learned?
Well, this all started back in last January when Canadian and American officials held a meeting to talk about trade, get to know each other. And at the end of that meeting, they put out a readout. It looked like this. And essentially, the Americans expressed concern with Quebec's Bill 96, which is a Quebec language law. And I was thinking to myself, why would the U.S. be concerned about a provincial language law? Well, it turns out that they are quite concerned, and they have a lot of thoughts about it. The documents that we've obtained reveal that Bill 96 has been on the radar for the U.S. Trade Representative's office since at least November 2022. Those were the earliest documents that we got. And it turns out that they are also being lobbied behind closed doors by some groups with some pretty deep pockets. The International Trademarks Association and also some very large corporations like Stanley Black & Decker, Hershey, Microsoft, and Procter & Gamble. Now, those companies and that association are concerned that some of the provisions of Bill 96 that have to do with trademarks and labeling and signs and things like that could make it more difficult for them to do business in Quebec. And they are also concerned that it could violate trade sanctions. They talked about 3 different kinds of trade sanctions that they believe that it could violate. And they were trying to make this case to the U.S. Trade Representatives people. And they think that it will make it harder for them to do business in Canada, which is the basis for arguing that they're trade sanctions. But one of the people we talked to was Mark Warner. He is an international trade lawyer, and his take on it was that if the U.S. does impose sanctions, these would be fairly minor in terms of trade conflict compared with the much bigger issues that we have with the U.S. Things like automobile origin of pieces and things like that, the dairy, softwood lumber, the digital sales tax. These are all things that are ongoing trade negotiations or conflicts between Canada and the U.S. So he thinks this will be small. It could be an irritant, but he says it is something that Canada should watch.
Well, interesting that it caught your eye and that it turned out to be of some significant concern. So what could this potentially mean for Canadians living outside of Quebec?
Well, it depends on what the Americans decide to do. If they do decide that trade sanctions are the solution, and I think a lot of people are sort of waiting to see what the final regulations to implement Bill 96 will be, and whether the Quebec government will have listened to some of these groups that are urging them to soften things or maybe make them go away completely. If they do impose trade sanctions, that could affect Canadians in a lot of different ways, depending on which kind of mechanism they choose and what kind of sanction they decide to impose on Canada. On a more concrete situation, the International Trade Association warns that even if there aren't trade sanctions, that Bill 96 risks making it more expensive for Canadians outside Quebec and also make it harder to get products in Quebec. Jenny Simmons is with that association. Here's what she had to say.
I think your average Canadian, whether they reside in Quebec or Vancouver or Halifax, should be concerned that there are going to be fewer products on the market and that those products will be more expensive.
She explains that one of the problems is that a lot of U.S. manufacturers, they don't just ship to every province. They ship to one place in Canada, and it gets distributed from there to the various provinces. And the expense and the cost of the challenge of trying to separate out things for Quebec or make all of the products have the same labeling that Quebec requires, for example, with the dominance of French, that would be very difficult for a lot of manufacturers. And a lot of them will take a look at the cost, take a look at the market size for Quebec and for Canada, may decide that it's not worth it. And then in that case, Canadians may find that they have a lot less selection when it comes to those things that they want to buy.
Okay, we'll continue to follow how this plays out. Elizabeth, thanks so much. That's the CBC's Elizabeth Thompson in Ottawa.